Sicilia. For those of you that are not familiar with Vega Sicilia or have not heard of a Vega Sicilia, even though the name gets a little bit of an idea that we're in Italy because of Sicilia, we're not, we're in Spain actually. We're in Ribera del Duero in the northern, sort of center north part of Spain. So what you're seeing here is an image of the winery. This state was founded in 1864, so we're over 150 some years already. And it's actually a pretty large property. It's about a 1,000 hectare property, but only 200 hectares are vineyard. The rest, well, for many years, it was an agricultural farm, so there were other crops planted. And nowadays, everything is pretty much forest. We also have a cork tree plantation, obviously the winery facilities and such. And the winery has worked really hard in kind of keeping that, the traditional old-fashioned sort of outside of the winery, and we have just updated everything inside. I'll explain that in a second. A little bit of background on the winery and the history of it. Like I said, it was founded in 1864 by Eloy Lecanda. It has had 5 owners throughout its history. It's currently the Alvarez family who actually purchased the winery in 1982 to Hans Newman. He was actually, the previous owner was actually the only one that was not Spanish. He was a very wealthy businessman from Venezuela that tasted Unico in a wine fair in New York in 1965, and he fell in love with the wine and decided to purchase a winery. Obviously, at the time, the winery was not very well known outside of Spain, and it did not have the prestige it has today. And he actually gave the winery as a wedding present to his son. And his son was not really in the wine business. He was not really interested in going into wine. So he decided to sell Vega Sicilia. And he reached out to David Alvarez, who is the gentleman that's sitting in that picture that has Pablo's hands on his shoulders, to find a buyer for Vega Sicilia. So the Alvarez family, at that time, 1982, they were already also a wealthy family from Spain. They have actually a business that's their main business, which is not in wine, it's a service industry, cleaning and security and such. It's a multinational that's oriented towards services. And David was not really looking into going into wine, but he started looking at Vega Sicilia. It was a winery that in the 80s was pretty prestigious in Spain, but was only exported to 3 other countries. Nowadays, we export to almost 150 countries around the globe. So David decided to buy Vega Sicilia for the family instead of finding another buyer for the property, with the idea of selling Vega Sicilia in a couple of years. It was purely a business investment. But he actually put one of his 7 children in charge. He put Pablo, who is actually the one that has his hands on David's shoulders, in charge of Vega Sicilia. So Pablo was a lawyer. He was 30 years old. He lived in Madrid. He was not really knowledgeable about wine, or didn't have really particular interest in wine other than, you know, the traditional family dinner or party. He knew Vega Sicilia was pretty prestigious, but he did not have any particular knowledge about the wine industry. He started driving from Madrid, which is in the center of Spain, and it's about a 2-hour drive. It's like straight north of Madrid. This is this sort of a map of Spain. If you can locate Madrid, is kind of in the center of that. And we are on the banks of the Duero River, in sort of one of the extreme sides of Ribera del Duero. And Pablo started driving to Vega Sicilia first once a week, then twice a week. He started working really closely with Jesus Andon, who was at the time the general manager and actually managed the property for over 30 years. And Pablo completely fell in love with Vega Sicilia and with wine in general. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because to this day, Pablo is not only the CEO of the company, he's extremely involved in all areas of the process, from the vineyards, winemaking, all major decisions. And he is the one that has actually traveled across the world to present the wines, and the reason why Vega Sicilia is particularly well known nowadays and considered one of the most prestigious international wineries. So what happens with Vega Sicilia? What does it make it unique, besides the fact that it has a very long history of producing these wines? The first vintage of Unico that we have with the label is 1915. So it's not only its history, its history as an old winery. It's also the fact that nowadays, for I guess wine drinkers, it's a very good moment to like wine, because we have wonderful wine coming from almost anywhere in the world, right? Very unique, very particular different varietals, very different price points. We have really great wine coming from a lot of places, but in the wine world, there's still 10 to 15 places that are considered the great wine terroirs of the world. And Vega Sicilia happens to be one of those great wine terroirs in the wine industry. Why? Well, like any other great wine terroir, is completely linked to the vineyard, to the place where the vines were planted. Like I mentioned before, when the winery was founded in 1864, this was kind of an old hacienda in Spain. So there were other things that were planted, and Eloy Lecanda decided to plant the vineyards like it was done elsewhere in Europe, where they couldn't really grow anything else. You wouldn't plant vines where you could grow potatoes or you could grow cereal. You would go and plant the vines where there was really nothing that could be planted. So that is one of the main reasons Vega Sicilia is so unique. Is one of those great wine terroirs. And the second one is obviously the aging of Vega Sicilia. I'll explain that when we get to, I'll give a little bit of a brief explanation of each of the vintages that are now in the collection, but it's a wine that's aged usually for a minimum of 10 years before release to the market. And it's a wine that, because of two factors, we believe it's the aging, but obviously also the quality of the grapes that we get from the Vega Sicilia vineyard. It's a wine that has a very unique capacity of aging, like very, very few wines in the world can match. Maybe some great French wines can match the aging potential of Vega Sicilia. Vega Sicilia nowadays, if you actually manage to find vintages from 1948 or 53, are wines that are still drinkable, are wines that you still open the bottle and the wine's still alive. I mean, it's obviously going to show evolution, but there are very few wines in the world that can give you an experience of actually open a wine that's 40 years plus, and you can still taste some fruit and some tension in the wine. You can see that the wine is still there. It's not completely dead. And that's what has made Unico such a wine that is very sought after by collectors and people that want to sell a wine, eventually either resell it or have the experience of drinking really old wine in the world. So that's pretty much what I wanted to explain first. This is an image so that you have an idea of the farm. This is the chapel that's been there since the 1800s. We kept the whole facade, the outside, and in the inside, actually everything is renewed. We have the offices. The Alvarez family has invested a lot in the vineyards first, and I also want to go a little bit into detail there, but also in the cellar. We have a cellar that most people get really impressed when they walk in. We have all the facilities, all the equipment. It's really modern, and we try to combine the tradition of Vega Sicilia with the best that technology can give us today to produce the best wines that we can produce nowadays. Vega Sicilia, like I said, our vineyards are 200 hectares of vineyard. And when the Alvarez family arrived, they really quickly understood that the main asset of Vega Sicilia was the vineyard. And there was a patrimony that needed to be kept for future generations. So they launched a whole program of research in the vineyards. They brought in universities from France and Spain, and they brought in who is currently our viticulture director, Enrique, to map out our soils, to really understand what was happening in that vineyard. What you're seeing in the picture is a vineyard that's over almost 100-year-old vineyard. Those are actually bush vines. I don't know if you get the perspective, but if you actually stand next to one and you sit there, it's like a little tree. The vine is actually a little bit, if you sit, the vine will go over your head. They're very big bush vines. And this is planted like it was planted back in the day. We actually didn't really plant by row. It was kind of scattered. And it's not one single vineyard plot. It's many varietals are mixed in there. Eloy Lecanda brought a lot of vines from France, Cabernet Sauvignon, Petit Verdot, Malbec. So the original founder brought a lot of wines from France, and they're mixed with local varietals like Tempranillo, Albillo Blanco, Tempranillo Blanco, which are local varietals, okay? So coming back to the point that the family decided to map out our soils, we discovered that only in our property, we have 19 different types of soils, and we have actually divided the property in 52 different plots. Every single plot it's sort of divided based on its soil, but also based on the clone that's planted, based on the exposure, the altitude, many factors. Ribera del Duero is the most complex, the oldest and most complex geological formation in the Iberian Peninsula. So Ribera del Duero means that we have 19 different types of soils. Our neighbors are going to have something else. The ones that are across from the, let's see, across the highway, they're going to have something else. So it's very difficult in Ribera del Duero to really say that you have one type of soil or that you have the same type of terroir that your neighbor next door. Just in our property, we have 19 different ones. So everything has been mapped out, and we actually harvest and vinify by plot. And we go through the first stages of the aging process that I'll explain in a second by plot, and we see how the wine is evolving in barrel. And then we start blending together the different plots. So it's like making 52 different single vineyards and then start blending them together to get your final wine. In terms of the aging, so the wine is aged in both barrel and oak vat, really big oak vats, similar to the ones I use here, but are meant for aging. The barrels, we use French and American oak. We actually have our own cooper at the Vega Sicilia farm that's been there for 3 generations. Actually, the current cooper, Jose Enrique, he was actually born inside the farm because old farms in Spain, the people that work there actually lived inside the state. It's no longer the case, but he was born there and he's our cooper. He actually builds the American oak barrels. We buy the oak staves in Kentucky and Ohio. We import them, we curate them, so we leave them outside in pallets for them to rain and dry and drain, get wet and dry, so that the pores of the oak close together, get closed or closer. And then we build our own American oak barrels that we use for the first about year and a half of the aging of Unico. And we also use French oak barrels. We work with different coopers in France, and we purchase all new oak every year. And then the wine is racked into larger formats. We rack the wine from the barrels into 10,000 and 20,000 liter oak vats, with the objective of giving the wine a much more complex aging process in which the wine is in contact with small portions of oxygen at different ratios throughout a really long period of time. Unico has between 5 and 5.5 years of aging in oak, okay? And then it is bottled, and it spends about 5 years in bottle before it's actually released to the market. So Unico is usually going to be released with at least 10 years of aging, but it's a wine that it's really not a recipe. It means that every single year, Pablo and the team, the winemaking team, and also the viticulture team, they open the bottles of wine, of the wine that's aging. We have obviously a massive aging cellar with all of the vintages that are aging, and they decide which vintage is going to be released. Actually, one of the vintages in this collection, 2006, is a vintage that was actually held back for an extra 2 years in bottle. So instead of doing a 10-year minimum aging, we aged that particular vintage for 12 years before releasing it to the market. Why? Because of the wine itself. We actually have a big vintage effect in Ribera del Duero. We have years that at least 4 years in a decade, we might have what's considered a cold vintage, maybe a rainy vintage. And then we have very generous warm vintages. So based on the vintage, it's also 2006, for example, was a particularly generous vintage in the region, generous and warm vintage in the region. So the wine had the tension and the structure and the power to actually benefit from a few more years in bottle before release. And cooler vintages, like the 2007, they're lighter, they're fresher. They may actually be released slightly in the 10-year mark or maybe a little bit before, just because they're going to age wonderfully. wonderful, but they're gonna be more ready in a way to drink when they're released. They don't really gonna benefit in the same way that the 2006 did. So like what I'm trying to say is that we sometimes don't release consecutive vintages of our wines. And we have very famous vintages in Vega Sicilia, like 1970 or 1974, that were released in the 90s. I mean, it was over 20 years before, after the harvest of the wine got released. I don't think we're actually going to be doing that anytime shortly, like holding a wine back for 25 years before releasing it. But what I'm saying is that 1970 got released in 1995. And it was, and I think 1974 got released a little bit before. So it's a wine that can really benefit from bottle aging. And like I mentioned in the beginning, it's a wine that's very well known for its aging capacity. So just a little bit, it's just a few pointers about the wines that are in the collection. So very interesting vintages, very good vintages, obviously. Unico 2004. Unico 2004 was a fantastic vintage in Ribera del Duero. It was considered up until the 2006 and 10 vintage, the best vintage that we had produced in many years. It's considered a textbook vintage, which means that we had all the factors that we needed throughout the growing cycle of the vine when we needed it. It rained when it had to rain. The temperatures were on spot when they had to be. So that makes it, for a vintage that's considered a textbook vintage, that means maturity is going to be perfect. The wine is going to, the harvest is going to have very, very good quality, etc. So it got very good ratings from the beginning. 14,000 cases released. Here I'm talking about 6 packs. I'm sorry, it's not 9 liters, it's 6 packs. 14,000 cases. And we always give a sort of a drinkability potential for our vintages, even though we know some of them could go way beyond that. And then some of them are actually pretty approachable when released. I mean, Unico 2004, I tasted the wine when it got released, and it's a wine that was completely approachable. It was a wine that was delicious. It's not that the wine is not drinkable when it's released. It's just that it has so much potential that if you have had the opportunity to drink Unico with more years in bottle, you understand that the wine is still young. But Unico 2004, I mean, the wine was showing beautiful. It's usually Unico, a blend of Tinto Fino, what we call Tempranillo, locally in Ribera del Duero, and Cabernet Sauvignon. And we have actually been reducing the percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon in the next vintages. Why? Because we actually have a whole program of replanting our own clones from our own vineyards. So we select our vines and we replant them. We actually have over 45 different clones of Tempranillo in our property. Some are clones that are unique to Vega Sicilia. We actually think there's a clone that's probably a Vega Sicilia clone of Tempranillo. And obviously, the more we plant Tempranillo, we realize that it's the grape that actually grows the best. And we firmly believe that the best quality of grape you get, obviously the best quality of wine you're going to be able to produce. In the case of 2006, so this was a surprise because most people thought that 2004 was going to be the best vintage just because it was a textbook vintage. 06 was slightly more generous, warmer, but it is considered, after tasting by most critics, as one of the most spectacular vintages that Vega has had produced in the last decade. The next one that probably follows with that criteria would probably be 2010. Not to say that the other vintages are not good. Usually the wine, I'll explain that in a second with 2007, but usually the wine ages very well. It's just when the wine gets tasted when released, 06 was showing an spectacular profile. It was right on spot where it had to be. Also 94% Tempranillo, 6% Cab, about 15,000 cases released. And as you can see, fantastic scores. We really usually get very good scores in that sense. But this vintage in particular got 100 points from James Suckling and 98 from Robert Parker. And we also put out a drinkability sort of frame for 06, even though we do believe it's going to go down in history as one of the great vintages of Vega Sicilia. And 07, which is I believe is the kind of the interesting thing about Unico, is that it comes from a cooler vintage. So here you have a completely different profile. 07 was actually a vintage that was very wet. It rained a lot. But we ended up with a wine that's lighter and fresher. And even though I don't know if some of you are familiar with some of the sort of, I don't know how to say it, wine language or whatever, but they say that cooler vintages are sometimes the winemaker's vintages, just because the winemaker has to intervene a little bit more. In our perspective, it's not really the winemaker that intervenes, because Vega Sicilia has a history of producing wine for so long that Gonzalo, our winemaker, really thinks that his job, it's pretty simple in Vega Sicilia. He doesn't really have much to do anymore once the grapes arrive. It's pretty kind of set. It's more viticulturist vintage. Our director of viticulture, Enrique, is extremely knowledgeable, and he understands our vineyards so well that he would never pick grapes that are not exactly where they have to be. In this particular vintage, what happened is that we got a lot of rain. So usually there are two things that that can happen in those vintages. You can wait it out and wait for the rain to pass and for the grapes to kind of lose the extra water they get from the rain, or you can harvest really quickly before the rain arrives. The risk of harvesting before the rain arrives is that you can get up with green tannins and wine that's not perfectly mature. We usually wait out those periods, and Enrique did for this vintage, and we ended up with a lighter, fresher wine, but also extremely elegant and balanced. It's still a wine that has drinkability up until 2040, also got pretty good scores, and obviously because of the weather conditions that vintage, we had slightly lower production, well, smaller production in general. So this is pretty much the presentation I had for you guys. I think this, okay. So this is pretty much a presentation I had for you guys. It's just, I mean, there's so much information about the winery and the wines, but I just wanted to give you an introduction and try to really show you, well, how special the wines are, and a little bit of information on each one of the wines that are part of the collection from the Vega Sicilia perspective. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Perfect. That was super insightful there. Thank you, Diana. I certainly learned a lot. Do you guys, one random nerdy wine question before anybody else hops in. When you replant the vines, do they do it like the Massal method, where they just basically like bend the arm down into the ground, or do they take cuttings and?
That's sort of the main, yes, that's kind of the main method that we use. It's muscle selection, but because the whole program has become really well, bigger than just the muscle selection, we do also cut some of the well, parts of the vine, and we actually have a pepinarist in France that specializes in replicating our clones. So they also come, they help us with the muscle selection, but they also help us choose those vines, so sermons from those vines, so that they can actually replicate them in France and bring them back, and then we can just replant them.
Oh, cool. That's really interesting. So for those of you listening that don't exactly know, there's two ways to kind of replant vines, grapevines, and they're called clones for a reason. Basically, you're taking cuttings of a vine and then replanting them elsewhere. But the Massal selection is basically just taking a living arm of one of the vines and just bending it down and sticking it basically just like in the dirt, and then it grows roots from there. And once it's established enough, then you can kind of disconnect it from the main vine, and it grows its own kind of, you know, its whole vine. So that was why I was asking, because that's a really interesting way of doing things. And yeah, and it's a way to be on your own roots too, which is kind of interesting. Do you guys, I guess this is another nerdy wine question, and then we'll get to like more collection based questions. I guess there's not a phylloxera issue with the soil there much if they're planting more Massal in on their native roots.
No. There, I mean, obviously, after phylloxera, a lot of the vines were planted, but we still do have some of the really old vines that are where we're capable of doing Massal selection. Most of our soils are not sandy soils, so we obviously were affected by that. but we're still capable of doing massal selection for part of our vineyard. And then when we do have, like I said, to replant whole vineyards, which can happen, that's when we choose also the Wineries. Also because we're trying Vega Sicilia, we are not certified organic. We don't look to be certified organic, but we do follow all sustainable agricultural practices, and we firmly believe that you should treat a vine individually. So we have a whole team that is kind of looking at the vineyard and really seeing if there's a problem. We treat a specific vine. We don't treat the whole vineyard in a way. So in that sense, when we do have to replant, when you get cuttings and send them to a pépinière, so they can also identify if there are specific vines that have an issue, or specific vines that are more susceptible to certain diseases from the vineyards, or maybe others that you always in a vineyard are going to have one vine that no matter what happens, if it's a cooler vintage, if it's a warmer vintage, if there's water, if there's no water, there's always one vine or two vines that always manage to give fantastic fruit. So obviously what you want to do is replicate those vines that are showing a particular, I guess, strength in terms of the variability that we get in the region, and also for diseases and such. So that's why we also use cuttings to replicate our cones with pépinières. But massal selection is obviously something we do. I did not mention this, but all of our vines are dry farming. We don't irrigate any of our plots, not the younger ones, not the older ones, and we have managed to do it well so far. We hope it's gonna still be the case. If eventually we have to irrigate, we're not completely against it at all. Obviously, the most important thing is the vineyard, but we're very fortunate that our vines are they have adapted very well, and even in really dry years, we've managed to produce really high quality grapes.
Yeah, and I think I'm asking so many vineyard questions just based on like great wines like Unico, or even the other wines that are produced there, the Unico Especial Reserva and the Valbuena. I like what you said about the viticultural harvest rather than the winemakers or the wine growers harvest, because that's a sign of a truly great wine. Like, so, the best wines in the world are based on, all the work really starts in the vineyards, and there's very not little done in the wineries, but like if you have the great fruit to begin with, that's what the basis for a great wine. So that's really interesting to hear about. Something that I had a question about for the Unico style in general is I've heard that basically from winemaker to winemaker over the generations, there hasn't been that many compared to a lot of other places. There was like a distinct Unico style. So back in, I don't know when one of the main changes was like 50s, 60s, 70s, but a winemaker basically had to hand off kind of a style of Unico to help the winemaker create a style that was kind of similar. There's not like, I guess there's not a lot of variability in style. Is that the case? Is that how it's remained consistent, or is there kind of I know aside from the grapes used?
Well, obviously there's the grapes. The blend has changed over the years. Back in the 60s, 70s, Unico was still a blend wine completely. That means we had Tempranillo and Cabernet Sauvignon like we do today, but we also had other varietals that were planted like Petit Verdot and Malbec and some local white varietals that were in the blend. So it was a completely blend wine. So that's definitely a difference. I think another thing that I did not mention, that it's true that makes also Unico a very wine that's very, like I said, sought after by collectors and such, is that it's very consistent. That means that if you get a case and you open it, you're going to have consistency in the wine. If they tell you that the wine is going to age for 20, 30 plus years, it ages. It's not like you're going to open a case of the wine and then you're going to get maybe 2 bottles that are spectacular and then maybe 2 bottles that are completely dead, right? So there's a lot of consistency. I think one of the keys to Vega Sicilia, it's like you just said before, the wine is produced in the vineyard. So we give top priority to the vineyard. Our director of viticulture has been there for over, I think, 20, 25 years. So even though there has been a change in the winemaking team over the decades, even the winemakers they have stayed, I think the one that has stayed the shortest time, I think it was 17 years or so. Really their influence in the final product is not as evident, because one thing, we have followed the tradition of producing Unico, except for the changing the varietals that we had to do, obviously. The way the wine has been produced since the beginning, it's pretty similar to the way it's produced today. We obviously have more technology. We're able to make it so that the wine, it's cleaner, it's a little bit more polished, but the aging is still, I think it started in 1864 with 7 years, and we brought it up to 10 years. So I think that's the biggest difference that the winemaking has had. Other than that, and this comes from Gonzalo's words, who is our director of viticulture, he really thinks making wine in Vega Sicilia is just super easy for him, because he has really no particular intervention that he has to do in the wine. You know, the grapes come in, he has to ferment the grapes by plot, age them, and then kind of blend the plots, but he doesn't have to, you know, go in and see if he has to extract more or extract less, or he thinks it's very easy, to the point that sometimes it can be slightly boring for a winemaker to work in those conditions, because he doesn't really have that much influence. Definitely the wine, I think it's consistent, because from the beginning it was understood that the wine, the Vega Sicilia wines were produced 100% in the vineyard. So.
Awesome. Well, I see we've run over time here. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do have one last question, and then anybody else who has questions. Sorry, I'm bogarting your time. I've shared with you the article that we released about kind of Spanish wines rising in general, with more collectible wines, you know, whether it be from Toro or Priorat around the country being produced. Do you think this is, I think a twofold question. One, I feel like this is probably a side effect of all the hard work that Pablo's done, that people were respecting, you know, had basically a ground level of respect for Spanish wines already made by Vega Sicilia. But have you guys found it easier to sell wines around the world with, you know, kind of Spain's reputation growing as a whole? Is it easier than it once was, or is it still, you know, introducing Vega Sicilia?
Well, I think obviously, I mean, it helps. I think in general, Spain was a little bit late in terms of showing its wines to the world. Like they were kind of like sitting back for a long time, whereas France and Italy, they were out there, they were showing the wines, they were explaining the wines, they were pretty like out there in terms of the wines. And I think Spain came a little bit later in terms, so obviously it took them longer time to do that. But yes, for sure, the fact that a lot more producers of Spain are starting to produce higher end wines, more focused on terroir, more focused on lower yields, very high end production, helps everyone, of course, because there's more knowledge about Spain as a wine producing country. There's more knowledge about the way wine has been produced in Spain for such a long time, with regions that go back to 200 years old and such. So answering to your question, of course, we do think that there's more, I think consumers in general are more open to Spanish wine, and that has been sort of a group effort from the whole country and the different regions to go out there and show the wines. And also from some producers that are really looking to do something, like I said, something very unique, very high end, with very focused towards quality, and then putting their wines out there. People that like drinking wine can definitely tell the difference, right? It's just not a matter of just producing small batches or small quantities. It's also a matter of showing the quality that comes. Another important thing that I think Spain has, it's honestly a very, very good quality price ratio in general. I think Spanish wines, and I don't know if that's going to change over the years, but honestly, I think Spanish wines at all price points, the wine you get for the price you pay, the quality, it's very, very good. I think it's one of those countries that if you're looking for price quality, and I'm not talking just Vega Sicilia that we're connecting the higher end, a lot of wines that are on the lower end from Spain, you can get very good wine, very decent wine for the amount for the dollars you're paying, which is not what you find available from many other wine producing regions or countries. And I think that has also helped Spain a lot. especially with prices in France going up so high, even in the United States with prices going up so high. In general, people are looking for options that are they're very good quality, but are not priced as high. And I think Spain has a very good offer in that sense at all price points, including Vega Sicilia. I mean, we are sort of the Grand Cru of Spain, and our pricing does not compare to the Grand Crus or of France or even from California in a way, right? So I think that has also helped in general the wines get more attention everywhere.
Agreed. I love when I went to first start buying my own investment wines, Unico was one of the first ones I bought because I could get literally the best wines in the country without having to spend thousands of dollars a bottle, like you were saying, Bordeaux or Napa. So 100%. Does anybody else have any questions? Sandra, I'm sure you probably have one. Or anybody else in the crowd?
Yeah, I was looking at the that you were saying that you don't always get consecutive vintages, which obviously is a real challenge. And I was wondering what, with that small, in terms of your cases, 14, 15,000, that's pretty limited. Who are your biggest markets that for your wines right now?
So historically, in general, as export markets, Spain represents about 30% in general of our production. I mean, 30% stays in locally, domestically. Then in terms of export markets, Switzerland, it's a big market for us. In Europe, Switzerland, Germany, and the UK are the top markets there. And then in the Americas, it's Mexico and the United States. Those two are the biggest markets. Vega Sicilia, it's a very strong brand in all Hispanic, Latin American, Spanish-speaking countries, and even Portuguese, Brazil, because I guess a historic connection and etc. So the wines sell really, really well in all Hispanic communities and such. The United States, it's obviously the market with the most potential for us, because we also think it's the market where the wines are the least known, not only Vega Sicilia, but in general, like I said, Spanish wines. I mean, we've come a long way, but there's still a lot to say about Spanish wines in the United States. It's not like the UK or Germany or Switzerland, where they're already very familiar, very knowledgeable with all regions of Spain, all wines of Spain, etc. And in terms of Asia, honestly, Asia has been a market, like I said, Pablo himself, he kind of opened each one of these markets. So he is very attached to representing the wines, and he has taken kind of Asia as his kind of project in terms of opening. And he has done it in a very careful way in order to not go into issues of, fake bottles and black market and such. Asia for us represents, it's not a particularly big market at the moment, but or small. It's just it is also one of the markets with the greatest potential that we have. But yeah, to kind of summarize the answer, it would be Switzerland, in Europe, in the Americas, United States, and Mexico, and then obviously we do very well in the Emirates and things like that, in other parts of the world.
Thank you.
And keep in mind there, Sandra, those numbers she gave us were 6-bottle packs. So you can cut that in half for actual cases.
Yeah, I did. That's why I
Yes.
was shocked.
Yeah.
I was like, whoa, that's so limited. Okay. Wonderful.
And then just to clarify too, when you were saying the consecutive vintages, it's you guys will make an Unico almost every year, but it's releasing them. Sometimes you'll release one younger vintage before an older vintage. Is that right?
Yes. So we have two issues in Ribera del Duero. Some harvests or some years we have hail and frost, and unfortunately this comes really late in the year where you already had your flowering, so it kind of kills the production for many producers. And for Unico, up until the 2001 vintage, that was the last vintage of Unico that was actually not produced. 2001, we did not produce Unico in 2001 because we had an issue with hail and frost, so we kind of lost the production. And we do not produce from the second crop or the second growing of the vine. So after that, Vega Sicilia, what we did is we installed those big fans that you also have in Napa. That helps us with the frost, unfortunately not with the hail. So with the hail, what we do is we have adapted some of the pruning of the vines to make the flowering a little bit later in the year. So in case we do have hail in May, or like it happened in France this year or such, that we don't lose everything that we have. From 2002 on, we have produced every single vintage of Unico because, well, like I said, even in cooler vintages that are wet, etc., the vines are able to adapt. We're able to produce maybe less wine with really good quality. But yeah, while we don't release consecutive vintages, it doesn't mean that we actually skip the vintage. It's just that if, for example, right now the vintage that got released was 2011. It just got released in the US. I think it's going to get released now. If 2012, it's not ready to be released, or they think that it needs an extra couple of years in bottle, we may actually release 2012 in 2 or 3 years and see if maybe 2013 it's more suitable to be released. So that's what I meant. Like we kind of maybe younger vintages, or yeah, we kind of not skip the vintage, but we don't release them one after the other necessarily.
More strategic. Okay, thank you.
What's interesting to me about the vintages too is it looks like investors, there's an initial, they look for that initial release, and then like 2008 last year, from an investment point of view, saw a great year. I think it was one of the top 10 wines in the world in terms of value gain on Livex. Do you guys see that kind of flow and trends? Like we picked vintages that were specifically, you know, very well developed in the earlier 2000s, and obviously 2007 for its nuance and earlier drinkability. Do you see kind of different vintages of Unico come and go in vogue? And then we can let you go here. You've stayed 20 minutes longer.
No, that's perfect. Well, for example, with the 2008, 7 and 8 vintage, I think it's a matter of first of all, offer and demand. Both 7 and 8 were very short vintages for us. As you can see, 7 was 12,000 cases instead of the 15,000 that we usually produce. The same with 2008. Those were 2 consecutive vintages that came from very small productions. 2008 was a very, very small production, to the point that we actually produce a lot more 3-bottle cases than we did 6-bottle 6-packs, just because we had to divide the wine among, well, with all the clients and importers. So I think 2008 became a vintage that was very, you know, unavailable. Like all of a sudden it just became unavailable really quickly because there was no wine. The same with 2007. I think there's 2 factors at play. Obviously the vintage and the rating of the vintage, and the other one is the actual availability of the wine in the market. And those vintages where we produce a little bit less, even if it's 3,000 cases or such, it plays a role in the availability of the wine. We constantly get asked for library vintages, and Vega Sicilia, we don't release library vintages from the winery. The last time we did it with Valbuena, our second wine, or other label, let's say. And we did it like 4 years ago, and we released a vertical. It was a 6-pack of a vertical of what we had available, but it was not really old vintages. Vega Sicilia doesn't really sell library vintages directly from the winery. So that also kind of plays with things, for example, 04 and 06. Eventually, these are going to be, I mean, they're already vintages that collectors are looking for. And then maybe in 5 years, these are going to be the vintages that everyone's that like collectors are really going to be asking us for. We don't have them at the winery. There will not be library inventory that's going to be sold afterwards. Where I mean, it's not a practice that Vega Sicilia does. So the only way to actually get the wine is looking for it in the market, either auction houses or etc. And that's the only way you can actually have access to the wine. So I think that also plays a role with sort of the demand of the wines in general. Yeah.
You've been very gracious with your time. Should we open it, Billy, to some of our guests in the community?
I think so. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, well, I guess that's not, well, thank you again, Diana. 20 minutes extra. This has been really interesting for me, and I know I learned a lot, even though I felt I've been pretty deep in Vega Sicilia for the past, month or so researching for the collection, but this has been exciting. Thank you so much for the time. And next time you're up in Los Angeles or over on the East Coast where our founders are, we'll have to catch up for a glass and hear a little bit more. Like, and we'll let you know how the collection goes tomorrow. But yeah.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great being able to present, and thank you again for inviting me. And yes, for sure, next time we're up in LA, we'll let you know, guys. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.